All right, before you get started, let's go over a few things that I think are important when using a blending stub. Now, I'm actually new to using a blending stub. I typically don't use them. But for this project, I want you to try and use a blending stub. Now, one thing people tend to do is, let's say they're shading an area. They use the side of their pencil, right, which is great. Makes a pretty even marking area. And then they use their blending stub, and they go over that. The problem with that is you still see some streaks within the pencil lead. So an alternative is to use a scratch piece of paper. So this is my scratch piece of paper. And do this on, you don't want to do it above your drawing, because if you do it above your drawing, right, underneath, you'll end up getting a little bit of pencil lead. It's kind of faint, but that pencil lead, when you move that around in your paper, it'll spread it. So do this on a different surface. I'm going to add some pencil lead. Now what I'm going to do, to create that same tone, I'm going to use this pencil lead, but then I'm going to use my blending stick. So I'm going to go ahead and add some pencil lead to the blending stick. Then in that same area, I can spread that around, and then what that's going to do is create a more even tone. You might have some spots where it's not quite so even. You can go left to right to create that smooth tone. You could go in circle shapes, circular motions. This is also really good if you're trying to do a really light area. You just put lighter pressure on the paper. And you might increase that pressure depending on how much lead is coming off. But then you can get some really faint, really light areas that make your drawing stand out. Usually around the skin, you'll use stuff like this. If there was a wrinkle, you might actually add some pencil lead to your blending stub and then add that shadow. So let's say there was a wrinkle underneath here. You might add that shadow underneath the wrinkle. And then maybe there's another wrinkle right here. Right? And then if you need to add highlights, I would suggest using either a pink eraser with a sharp edge or a kneaded eraser, and just squish it out so that it creates a sharper edge. And then you can add those highlights in that shape itself. So anyway, those are just a couple tips. As I go through and I demo how to draw my own face, I want you to notice what I'm doing with my blending stub, how I use that to add these softer areas. And I use my blending stub, especially around teeth, that sort of thing. You're probably going to want to use your blending stub rather than a pencil, because you'll see when I'm drawing my picture what I'm talking about. Thanks. All right, so now you see me drawing my picture. The first thing I do, even before I start blending like this, I erased all of the grid marks in that area, and then the contour lines, I actually erased those, but I could barely see them. And then once I've done that, then I just shade in all of the lightest areas. Now all of the grid marks are erased where I'm blending or using my blending stub. If there's a new area, I erase it first, and then I use my blending stub to make those marks. It's really important that you get rid of the contour lines, because part of becoming a better artist and drawing is to identify the edges of things or of shapes. For example, some people, that crease in the middle of my forehead and between my two eyebrows, they would just draw a line. But there is no exact line. There's just a shadow that leads up to one edge, and then the remainder of the edge is erased or darkened, right? Whatever it is that you're making. You also notice I have a piece of paper underneath my hand. The reason I do that is so that any pencil lead that gets on my hand doesn't get smeared around on my paper, because if I'm moving a blending stub over the graphite, it's going to move that graphite around. If I move my hand on the graphite, it's also going to move that graphite around. So I just make sure to use that scratch piece of paper to protect the drawing of my face. And then every once in a while you'll notice that I use my value scale. That value scale is to make sure that I'm matching the tones. You can draw in your grid. You can draw like a number 2 or a number 1 if it's really light, 1, a 2 if it's a slightly darker, and you can create a value scale to do this. You don't have to, but I find it's helpful when I'm trying to match tones on my paper with the image I'm looking at. You'll notice when my hand is off the paper completely, I don't worry so much about smearing pencil marks, so I don't move my scratch paper. You'll also notice that I go between a pencil and using my blending stub. If I'm trying to make a really dark line, I'll use my pencil to make that mark. I don't use the graphite on a blending stub. And when you're adding hair or something like that, you'll see this when I go around the eyebrows especially, but you'll end up shading that area first so here I go with the eyebrow. So I'm adding the lines for the eyebrow just so that I got the outline. I add some lead to it, then I blend that lead together, and then afterwards I go creating the individual hairlines. And then some students, they'll just draw straight lines, right? But no, you still want to look at the eyebrow. Which direction are the eyebrow hairs going? Draw them in that direction. Are there a few flyaway eyebrow hairs? If there are, add them. It's just going to make it look more realistic by adding sometimes those imperfections. I probably was talking to a student at that point. I'll skip some areas where you don't see all of the details, but you'll see the basics of what I'm doing. Sometimes I switch between my pencil and using my blending stub to really blend in the different colors and different shades. I guess not colors, but different tones. Remember, as you're doing this, you're focused on what you see in your drawing, not so much what you imagine, right? You want to draw what you see. So you'll notice around the eye, I included some of those areas where I had some wrinkles. You want to include those sort of things. Whenever you're erasing, make sure that you're careful about what you erase, and when you're wiping off that eraser mark, make sure you don't wipe off or smear your pencil lead. Right, I'm getting rid of those contour lines, and then I draw those contour lines with my blending stub. Whenever it's a darker area, you can put pencil lead directly onto the paper, and it's totally fine because it's so dark that it ends up getting erased, most of it. Now, I wouldn't say this is my best drawing, self-portrait, but the principles and ideas behind this, I think, are super valid and super important. One thing I noticed is as I'm drawing the eyes, and I didn't notice this until afterwards, that the eyes, because there was so much on the left eye that was in the shadow, I couldn't tell where exactly the lines would start and end. And so I ended up making the iris a little bit too big, and then the pupil was a little bit off, and then the eyelid was a little bit wrong. And I mean, it looks okay, but ideally I would have more light showing on that side of my face so that I could see where those items are, see where the pupil is, the iris and whatnot. So for me, when I look at this drawing, I look at the eyes, the left side and the right side, and I keep and you'll probably have something like this happen too, where you're like, something's off and you're not sure what it is. Well, when I look at the eyes, I'm like, oh, something's off. I'm not quite sure what it is. And then I realized, my eyes just aren't the right size, aren't the right width. They should be slightly closer together. The nose should be slightly more narrow. But anyway, so now we're moving on to this other part, and you'll notice I switched out my scratch paper. That's important. Every once in a while you want to switch out that scratch paper with a different one, because little by little you'll get a little bit of graphite on that bottom of the paper, and you don't want that graphite to smear around on your picture, or your drawing. So switch out that scratch paper every once in a while. Also, if you notice, I switch around sometimes. I'll be working around the face, let's say the mouth, and then I'll get bored of that. You can switch around if you want. So maybe if you get sick of working around like the mouth and teeth area for a bit, then move over to the ear or whatnot. One thing you'll notice about the teeth is that anywhere in between the lines of the teeth, I make sure to use my blending stub as much as I can. Anywhere there's going to be a stark contrast between the teeth and like the background, then I use the tip of my pencil. Just be careful about that, because sometimes students draw the actual lines in between the teeth and there's not an actual line. Instead, it's just an implied line where it's shaded up until a certain area. So here I am moving from the teeth and mouth area up to the ear. Then I decide to add some of those darker shadows. Whenever you're working with facial hair, especially, like, I don't have a ton of facial hair, and so I have some bare spots. Now, as I'm drawing this facial hair, I want to make sure that I'm really copying what I see. Sometimes students will be like, oh, I have facial hair, and so they'll draw a full-on beard. But, I'm 33, and I still don't have a full-on beard. It's all about your genes, what you got, right? But I'm adding where I see hair in the image. That's what I'm adding to my face. And I'm not just drawing straight lines. I'm drawing the hairs in the direction that they're going on my face. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause the demonstration of showing you what I'm doing, just so the video is not too long. But I want you to pay close attention to those few things that will help you in your drawing. First thing is to use a scratch paper, right? Make sure you have a piece of paper that protects your drawing as your hand's above the drawing itself, so you don't smear it. Another thing is to use the blending stick in combination, blending stick like there, to do those shading light areas, and then also shading around like wrinkles and things like that, where it might look like a line, but it might be a little bit softer. And then also paying close attention to drawing contour lines versus drawing implied lines, right? Drawing the edges of a shadow, you're not going to have an actual line there. I've seen some drawings where the student will draw a line, like a physical line from here to there, like you would see in a wrinkle on a forehead. There's no physical line there. It's just an implied line. The shadow reaches a certain point and then it changes, and then reaches a certain point and changes. Those are not physical lines. They're just like drawn lines. They're just implied. So pay close attention to those. I think if you follow these tips, you'll do a great job on your final drawing. And don't worry if it's not perfect. The idea behind this is you're using a grid to focus on what you see one square at a time. Will we be using a grid throughout this course? No way. I think a grid is a good place to start and to learn from, but to be really good at drawing, in the future, you're not going to use a grid at all. But you're going to use the idea of looking at particular images, reference points like we do with in one square. Where does the line begin and end? We'll be looking at angles, like what is the angle of those lines that you're going to make, and you will become a better artist. But this is just like a starting point, a good starting point that will help you be a better artist. So keep it up, do a good job. Thanks.